Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 338 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. In light of this being episode 338, I think it makes perfect sense to talk about the 6.5 Creedmoor today. I'm just joking. We are actually going to talk about everything 338 caliber today in episode 338. So in this episode, I discuss all of the 33 caliber CIP and SAAMI certified cartridges, plus a couple of other noteworthy rounds, and I will discuss their history, legacy, their strengths and weaknesses, and their recommended uses in detail. Now, as always, I will be sharing some hard facts, but realize that I will also include my opinion in the commentary as well at certain points, talking about all of these different cartridges. You are welcome to disagree with me at any point. Just realize that I am an expert on my own opinion, just as you are with your own opinion. Now, before we get started today, I would like to extend an invitation to you to join the community I am building on Patreon at patreon.com/biggamehunter. Link also in the show notes. I conduct live question and answer sessions with my Patreon supporters a couple of times a year. I also share the results of some ballistic gel and ammunition tests and comparisons exclusively with Patreon supporters as well. I also prioritize correspondence with my supporters on Patreon above anyone else, just because I receive so many questions these days. I do take questions from the normal listeners to this podcast, but Patreon supporters get priority. I also have a couple of other cool bonuses that I give to supporters as well, so sign up at the link in the show notes and you can learn more. Buckle up, folks, because this is going to be a good one. We have 18 different cartridges to talk about today, so let's get started. And in this episode, I think it makes sense to start with the two oldest cartridges to help set the stage for things, but then we'll bounce around a little bit chronologically. Let's get started. First up, we have the 33 Winchester, also known as the 33 Winchester Centerfire. Now, this is not technically a SAAMI standardized cartridge, but this is really where the story begins with the 338 caliber. And my dad also had a rifle chambered in this cartridge. The 33 Winchester is basically a 45-70 neck down to 33 caliber. Introduced in 1902 for the Winchester Model 86 lever-action rifle. They also sold it in the Winchester Model 1885 single shot, and Marlin offered it in their Model 1895 lever-action rifle. The 1885 and 1886 Winchester rifles were both extremely popular at the time and were made in piles of cartridges to include 33 Winchester. This cartridge shot a 200-grain bullet at an advertised velocity of about 2,200 feet per second for about 2,150 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. This was a rimmed cartridge designed for use in lever-action and single-shot rifles. And since the 1886 had a tubular magazine, the 33 Winchester used a round or blunt-nosed bullet. Similar in power to the 35 Remington, which had virtually identical ballistics of a 200-grain bullet at around 21 to 2,200 feet per second. But the 35 Remington was a rimless cartridge, and the 33 Winchester also has a slightly higher sectional density since it uses a slightly smaller diameter bullet of the same weight, 33 caliber versus 35 caliber. This was not a great quote-unquote long-range round due to the blunt nose and comparatively low muzzle velocity of the bullet it would shoot, but it was devastating at short range. Phil Sharp had this to say about the 33 Winchester on page 729 of my copy of his book, Rifle in America. It used a 200-grain soft point at a muzzle velocity of 2,180 and was adequate for all North American big game at short ranges. It made an ideal deer and bear cartridge as it had a tremendous knockdown effect on game. End of quote. Now, Mr. Sharp talked about using it on deer and bear. I have no doubt that it would work really well on stuff like elk and moose at short range as well. Same thing with other similar-sized game. For instance, like I mentioned earlier, my dad had a 33 Winchester. His was a Model 1886. He took that rifle to Africa in 2005 on actually his very first safari, shot a red hartebeest, springbok, and gemsbok with it. As I was preparing for this episode, I talked to him about the load that he used, and he actually said he used a 250 grain Winchester ballistic silvertip that was actually designed for the .338 Win Mag. He said he measured a velocity, actually measured a velocity of 2,000 feet per second at the muzzle with that bullet. Now, the .33 Winchester and the .338 Winchester Magnum, which we'll talk more about here later, both used .338 caliber bullets, so you could interchange the bullets like that. But a 250 grain bullet like that is heavier than what was normal for the .33 Winchester. Now, some people say those old aluminum-capped ballistic silver tips he was using were very soft and they expanded well at low velocity. Other people have described it as a so-called controlled expansion bullet. I'm not exactly sure what the deal was with those bullets because Winchester stopped making that exact model over 30 years ago. And the silver tip that they sell now is completely different from those old aluminum capped bullets my dad was using. Email me, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com, if you have experiences with any of the old ballistic silver tips in any caliber that you can share with me. I may end up having to do a ballistic gel test to see what the deal is with those bullets and how really quote-unquote soft or tough they are in the grand scheme of things. But in any case, my dad said that they penetrated great and they killed everything that he shot with it really well. I'm not sure how much expansion he was getting with those bullets at that slower velocity. Shots weren't very long, but they also weren't going that fast out of the muzzle to begin with. But in any case, springbok, gemsbok, hartebeest are all right in that size range where the .33 Winchester is great, provided you're taking shots on the shorter side, like he was, mostly inside 100 yards. Winchester eventually replaced the .33 Winchester with the slightly more powerful .348 Winchester when they rolled out that new cartridge in 1936. Now, that was a big year for Winchester. They introduced the Model 70 bolt action and the Model 71 lever action all right around that same time. Now, my book, Cartridges of the World, says Winchester officially, quote-unquote, dropped the .33 Winchester from their lineup in 1940. The Model 71 lever action I just mentioned was very similar to the Model 1886 action, just stronger. Likewise, the .348 Winchester, very similar to the .33 Winchester centerfire, just more powerful. My Winchester handbook describes it as, quote-unquote, basically an improved .33 WCF. That newer cartridge shoots larger .348 caliber bullets of the same weight, so you have a 200 grain bullet at 24 to 2,500 feet per second instead of about 2,200 feet per second like the .33 Winchester. I heard that some Model 71s may have been manufactured in .33 WCF, but my Winchester handbook says that is not the case, and aside from a few experimental guns made for the ballistics lab, all Model 71 rifles were chambered in .348 Winchester. So the .33 Winchester is basically a dead cartridge at this point. You can still find some vintage ammo out there. Same thing with vintage 1885, 1886, and 1895 rifles, but you basically need to hand load for it though. But if you're the sort of guy that's like my dad that really likes classic lever guns and vintage cartridges, then the .33 WCF, great choice. All right, next we have the .333 Jeffery. Released in 1908, this cartridge was basically a .404 Jeffery neck down to .333 caliber. So the .33 Winchester used .338 caliber bullets. The .333 Jeffery used .333 caliber bullets. As was often the case during that time frame, Jeffery actually released two almost identical cartridges that bore the .333 Jeffery name. There was a rimmed and a rimless version of the cartridge. You have the .333 Jeffery and the .333 Jeffery flanged. The flanged was the rimmed version of the cartridge designed for use in double-action rifles. The rimless version was designed for use in bolt-action rifles. Both used .333 caliber bullets. Very similar ballistics between the two of them, but the rimless version was a little bit more powerful. But both used very heavy, really high sectional density bullets at a moderate velocity. So there was 250 grain and 300 grain loads for each of them. Cartridges of the World lists the following ballistics for the rimmed version. You have a 250 grain bullet at 2,400 feet per second and the 300 grain bullet at 2,150 feet per second. So you got about 3,200 and about 3,090 foot-pounds of muzzle energy, respectively, for them. The rimless version fires the 250 grain bullet at 2,500 feet per second and the 300 grain bullet at 2,200 feet per second for about 3,480 and 3,230 foot-pounds of energy, respectively. Now, the 250 grain bullet had a sectional density of 0.322 and the 300 grain bullet had a sectional density of 0.386. This was a pretty long cartridge, just under 3.5 inches long, used a very long, skinny bullet. So we have these pretty heavy, really high sectional density bullets fired at a moderate velocity. As you can imagine, recoil was not very bad. People could shoot them pretty well. And that 300 grain loading in particular tended to penetrate extremely well. Now, the 250 grain bullet did not have a great reputation, or at least that's what John Taylor says in his book, African Rifles and Cartridges. It seems like Jeffery just made that bullet a little bit too soft, and it probably did very well on game like leopards and lion, but not so good on bigger game. John Taylor said the only instances he heard of people having issues with the 333 Jeffery were using 250 grain bullets that quote unquote broke up and didn't penetrate well. Now, like I mentioned earlier, there was the rimmed and the rimless version of this cartridge designed for use in bolt action and double rifles. Well, one of the other problems this cartridge seemed to have was that the double rifles Jeffery made were regulated for use with the 250 grain bullet and not the 300 grain bullet for some reason. Exactly why they chose to do it that way, I don't know, but that is just one of the things you have to deal with a double rifle. It's not as simple as a magazine rifle where you adjust your sights or adjust your scope for a different point of impact or anything like that when you go from one bullet to another. If the rifle's regulated to shoot one load, you can try a different load in it and see how it does. But if it doesn't shoot well, it's a pretty lengthy and involved process to remedy that. But in the case of someone that had a rifle that you could shoot those 300 grain loads in, it had a great reputation. Here's what John Taylor had to say about it. Its long, heavy 300 grain bullet is a splendid killer and holds its velocity extremely well. It has great depth of penetration and is one of my favorite bullets. Time and again, I have driven it the length of an animal's body and cut the perfectly mushroom bullet out of its hindquarters. I have never had one break up. End of quote. At a different point in his book, he talks about shooting a water buck straight on in the throat and then recovering the bullet from the animal's hindquarters. He also said that he killed 11 elephant with 11 shots from a 333 Jeffery magazine rifle. But he also talks about some of the shortcomings of that cartridge in cases where people did not place their shots appropriately. Like I mentioned, this cartridge seemed to do very well, very easy to shoot. Guy put the bullet where it needs to go. It kills the animal pretty quickly, even on an elephant. But you can have some problems if you don't do that because your margin of error is just much smaller with this cartridge than is the case with one of the big doubles. Here's a quote that describes exactly what I'm talking about from African Rifles and Cartridge. I quote, "As an example of this, I might just mention two young fellows who went out after their first elephant armed with a 333 and a 318, with which they had shot a fair quantity of non-dangerous game, and because of their success, had exalted their rifles to quite ridiculous heights. I heard their shooting spasmodically through the morning, and it was apparent to me that they were firing together, presumably at the same elephant, as they had told me they intended to do. They quite casually mentioned at the time that, of course, either weapon was quite capable of doing the work on its own, but that since they were new to the game, they would both fire together, and no elephant could stand up to both weapons simultaneously, while the combined power of the two would far surpass a 500. As it subsequently transpired, they put a volley into the bull each time they caught up with him in the light open forest, in which they found him. Finally, he had enough of it and ambushed them. When he charged, they blazed away from their magazines without taking time to aim with certainty, and so were unable to stop him. He killed one and seriously injured the other before moving off a short distance to lean against a tree. He died there in a kneeling position so that I could count the bullet wounds in him. There were 42 of them. Now, that in no way reflects on either of these rifles. Either of them could have killed that elephant with a single well-placed bullet at the very commencement of the hunt. Either could have dropped him stone dead in his tracks as he charged. But the two unfortunate youths were quite excusably nervous and rushed things. The whole and sole reason why some men prefer medium bores to large bores is because such weapons are considerably lighter and handier, and they reckon they can use them with greater precision than they could more powerful weapons. Greater precision. That is the important thing to remember, but it is too often forgotten. End of quote. Now, the .333 Jeffery was eventually pushed out of the spotlight by the introduction of the .375 Holland in Holland in 1912, and the cartridge was really hurt when Kynoch stopped producing ammo for many of their old safari rounds in the 1960s. Now, this cartridge and these rifles are still out there. You can make it work if you dig up one of those old rifles. I know some companies like Woodley do produce, say, a 300 grain bullet in .333 caliber that you can use to hand load for it, and it will work great on plains game and whatnot, but it's one of these cartridges that's basically dead now too, and like I said, you can make it work for you. It just takes some work. Next, let's talk about the .338-06. Just like the name says, this is the 30-06 case necked up to .338 caliber. I am not sure who did it first or when, but just like folks did with the 30-06 by necking it down to become cartridges that we now know as the 25-06, the 270, and the 280, other folks started necking the 30-06 up to use larger diameter bullets. The 35 Whelen is one example. The .338-06 is another. The story of this round actually goes back to 1945 when three men named Charles O'Neill, Elmer Keith, maybe you've heard of him, and Don Hopkins developed a wildcat they called the .333 OKH. The OKH for O'Neill, Keith, and Hopkins, the initials of their last names. This was a 30-06 necked up to shoot .333 caliber bullets. This was the same bullet the .333 Jeffery I just mentioned earlier used. Now, the round was reasonably popular at the time, and it worked really well as sort of a 30-06 on steroids, sort of like the 35 Whelen. In fact, it's really ideally suited for the same use cases as the 35 Whelen. Now, remember, this cartridge came out in 1945 in the days before we had so-called quote-unquote premium bullets. No Barnes bullets. This was before the Nosler partition, the trophy-bonded bear claw, all of that stuff. So you really just had a couple different flavors of cup and core bullets, and that was it. For that reason, guys like Elmer Keith and other people tended to go with the really super heavy bullets that had a lower impact velocity and a higher sectional density that allowed them to still penetrate very well, even with a pretty soft cup and core bullet. And that 300 grain bullet in particular was a favorite of Elmer Keith with the .333 OKH. He says in the Nosler Reloading Handbook that he has seen this cartridge used on American big game with excellent results. Now, that said, the introduction of the .338 Win Mag in 1958, which we'll talk more about here in a minute, pushed the .338 caliber bullet diameter ahead of the .333 bullet diameter, especially in the United States. Now, you could still find .333 caliber bullets, and like I said earlier, Woodley does list them in their catalog, but they are nowhere near as common as .338 caliber bullets right now. With that in mind, people eventually adopted the .333 OKH and or the original 30-06 case to shoot .338 caliber bullets. The A Square Company eventually standardized the .338-06 with SAAMI as the .338-06 A Square in 1996 using those .338 caliber bullets. In fact, it was one of the first two cartridges they submitted to SAAMI. The other was the 7mm Shooting Times Westerner. Now, the actual performance of the 338-06 is basically identical to the old 333 OKH, just with 338 caliber bullets. And really common bullet weights are a little bit different now too. Instead of 250 and 300 grain bullets, like was the case being most popular for the 333, now you have some lighter bullet weights that are more popular with the 338-06. Now, Cartridges of the World says that load data is basically interchangeable for the two cartridges. Just make sure you use the appropriate diameter bullets in each one, though. So as far as ballistics for the 338-06 go, you have a 180 grain AccuBond at about 2950, a 200 grain AccuBond at 2800, a 225 grain partition at 2600, and hand load, anyway, of a 250 grain bullet at 25 feet per second. Here is what Craig Boddington had to say about the 338-06 in the book, Any Shot You Want. I quote, "However you view it, the 338-06 is an extremely versatile hunting cartridge, offering superb power and penetration at a very modest cost in recoil and muzzle blast. With lighter bullets like the 200 grain Nosler ballistic tip, it is an excellent deer rifle for anything except the most open country. A 300-yard shot is not unreasonable. With heavier bullets, it is a great elk round, again, for anything except long range. With the A-Square Dead Tough 250 grain bullet, it is an outstanding moose and black bear cartridge, and could certainly be used for the biggest bears as well." End of quote. Now, Boddington also mentions that Chub Eastman, who worked at Nosler at the time, used a 338-06 to take a great moose up in British Columbia, and he also ended up taking a record book grizzly bear with that same rifle on that same hunt. Now, as cool as the 338-06 is, it has unfortunately fallen by the wayside. A-Square is defunct. You can still find rifles and ammo out there, but selection is very limited. Nosler used to make ammo for the cartridge, and I think they were the company that made it most recently as I record this. I've heard Weatherby did at one point, and same with Hornady, but none of those companies make ammo for it anymore. Hindershots actually does make custom ammo for the cartridge, and you could get with a company like Superior Ammunition, I'm sure, as well, to get some custom hand loads. And you can, of course, hand load for it yourself. And due to the nature of the cartridge, if you can't find a rifle that's already in 338-06 and you want one, it is a relatively simple job just to take a 30-06 rifle and put a new barrel on it in 338 caliber. And there you go. Kind of like how I did with my 9.3 by 62. So this is still one of those more specialized cartridges out there right now. Not quite to the degree of the 333 Jeffery or the 33 Winchester, but it's not like you can go down to Cabela's and buy rifles and ammo off the shelf, unfortunately. But that is not the case with the next cartridge, though, which is easily the most popular out of all the cartridges we'll discuss in today's episode, the 338 Winchester Magnum. So let's rewind the clock back to the 1950s. Like I've mentioned before, America had a gigantic economic boom right after World War II. Gun companies like Winchester switched back from making weapons for the military to making civilian firearms. They basically stopped making civilian firearms in 1941 when the war started, and so they just hit pause on everything there. And then when they restarted, they dropped some of their less popular offerings from their lineups. They continued making others, like the 270 and the 30-06, and they also started making some other new cartridges. Well, at that time, lots of people wanted quote-unquote Magnum performance out of a standard action cartridge. So they built a whole new line of belted Magnum cartridges based on neck down or necked up 375 H&H cases that they shortened to fit in a standard length action rifle. Remember, a full-length Magnum action will accommodate cartridges up to 3.6 inches long, like the 375 H&H, whereas the 30-06 is shorter at 3.34 inches long. So they wanted to make some new cartridges that would fit in a shorter 30-06 length action. Well, their .458 Winchester Magnum came out first in 1956 and was quickly followed by the .264 and .338 Winchester Magnum in 1958. This was the first mass-produced .338 caliber round since the .33 Winchester. I'm not exactly sure why they went with .338 caliber here instead of .333 caliber. Maybe they were sitting on a giant pile of .338 caliber bullets left over from the .33 Winchester days and they wanted something to do with them. Maybe they were already tooled up to produce bullets of that diameter. But in any case, this would not be the first time Winchester made a cartridge that solidified a particular bore diameter, like they did with the .270 Winchester and the .277 caliber. But in any case, that's the direction they went. That set .338 caliber as the bullet diameter for .33 caliber rounds going forward. And like I just mentioned, it helped kill the .333 OKH and establish the .338-06 instead. So they take this .375 H&H Magnum case, neck it down to .338 caliber, shorten it a little bit to fit in a .30-06 length action, and there you go, you got the .338 Win Mag. It was marketed as a solid choice for big game in North America, elk, moose, big bears, that sort of thing. Yeah, you could also hunt deer with it if you wanted to, though that is not what it was really designed to do. You could also take it to Africa for plains game. You could take basically on anything on Earth this side of Cape Buffalo with the .338 Win Mag. Not saying you couldn't kill a Cape Buffalo with one, and I'm sure many people have, but it just doesn't meet that .375 caliber minimum for dangerous game hunting in many countries. Now, the .338 Win Mag cartridge itself was great, but the fact that it was available in a reasonably priced, yet still high quality and very popular rifle in the Winchester Model 70 helped push it over the top. Now, like I have mentioned before, this whole series of Winchester Magnum cartridges were perfect rounds for the quote-unquote greatest generation. A man that was 20 in 1940, served in World War II, did his time, got out, got a job, started a family, started moving on with his life, all that stuff. He'd be 38 in 1958. Starting to get to that age where family and career often allow for more quote-unquote exotic hunts out west and in Africa. Well, all of those new belted Magnum cartridges were perfectly positioned for them. Hey, you want to go up to Alaska and kill a big brown bear or a moose, or you want to go out to Colorado and shoot an elk? Well, this .338 Win Mag is exactly what you need. Winchester started out producing 200, 250 grain, and 300 grain factory loads for the .338 Win Mag. It tended to be most popular at the beginning anyway, with 250 grain and to a lesser extent 300 grain bullets at first. I'm not aware of any companies that still produce factory hunting loads for the .338 Win Mag with a 300 grain bullet, but my Speer number 10 manual from 1979 says factory loads with a 300 grain bullet were getting just over 2,400 feet per second at the muzzle. Now remember, this is 1958. Just about everything was a cup and core bullet back then. The partition was literally brand new. There were no Barnes bullets, no bonded bullets, no other quote-unquote premium bullets to speak of at the time. Now, those heavier bullet weights had a very good sectional density. You have .313 for the 250 grain bullet and .375 for the 300 grain bullet. That is a ridiculously high sectional density. And those bullets were propelled at a respectable, though not excessive, velocity out of the .338 Win Mag. So penetration and terminal performance were excellent. I don't really know for sure, but I just feel like things were left a little bit more to chance then with this sort of thing. At least in my readings, it didn't seem like companies tested their products as thoroughly back then, right? I don't think ballistic gel was even a thing then. I think that only kind of came along after the FBI Miami shootout in 1986. And I'm sure they would test their new products afield on game to a certain extent, but it just feels like it wasn't as, like I said, thoroughly tested and wrung out prior to the launch of a product back then compared to the case now, where they'll shoot lots of rounds into ballistic gel to check their terminal performance ahead of time, get guns and ammo into the hands of their employees and gun riders and have them take that stuff afield, hunt with it, hopefully identify any problems with it so they can fix them before the release, all of that sort of thing. And so it seems like cartridges made their reputations back then, especially based on how they happened to perform with common bullet weights and velocities available at the time. Too light of a bullet with too fast of a velocity could mean problems for cartridge reputation. But a combination like we saw with the 338 Win Mag with those 250 grain and 300 grain bullets worked really well and worked to enhance the reputation of the cartridge. Here's what Craig Boddington had to say about the 338 Winchester Magnum in that section of Any Shot You Want. They might have missed a bit with the 264, but they were spot on with the 338. Although the cartridge was very slow to catch on, today it has become an Alaskan favorite, and also one of the top choices among serious elk hunters. I've been on 3 Alaskan brown bear hunts, and all 3 times my guides carried 338 Winchester Magnums for backup. Recently, I did a survey of North American guides for my book, American Hunting Rifles. Among more than 100 guides/outfitters, the 338 was the top choice for bears, both as a personal choice and as a recommendation to clients. It came in 4th under the elk/moose category, still a strong showing among so many choices. With its relatively small case capacity, the 338 Winchester Magnum is not a velocity star, but it's not all that bad, and the wonderful sectional density of the .33 caliber bullets give it superb downrange characteristics. I don't consider it a long-range cartridge, but it carries well enough for normal ranges and can be stretched in a pinch. Most of all, though, it offers the bullet weight and frontal area to really thump large and heavy game. Well-known hunters Jack Atchison Sr. and Jr. use the 338 almost exclusively, and Jack Jr. describes the 338 better than I possibly could. Quote-unquote, it numbs them. End of both quotes. All right, so this cartridge came out in 1958, and that Craig Boddington quote was from a book published 1996. Now, since the introduction of the 338 Win Mag, the advent of better quality bullets has resulted in a downward shift in the most popular bullet weights. As I record this, 200, 210, and 225 grain bullets are most common now. The 250 grain is still around, and the 300 grain is definitely out there, but still not nearly as common as it used to be. Here in 2024, a 210 grain factory load will be going about 2950 feet per second, the 225 grain load at about 2750, and the 250 grain load at about 2650. So you compare that to the 338-06, 225 grain bullet at 2600. So going 150-ish feet per second faster than the 338-06 with the same bullet weight. Now, my Lyman and Nosler reloading handbooks both indicate about 2,400 feet per second and change is possible with 300 grain bullets today. And remember, that's for hand loads. What other cartridge shoots a 300 grain bullet about that fast? If you said the 375 H&H, you're right. 2550 with a 300 grain bullet is a pretty standard load out of a 24-inch barrel for the 375. Kevin Robertson even talks about downloading his client 375 to a muzzle velocity of 2350 to about 2400 feet per second and seeing excellent results with it on buffalo. So yes, the 375 H&H is a little more powerful, but the 338 Win Mag is right there with it. And it's right at the cusp of meeting the minimum muzzle energy requirement of 3,900 to 4,000 foot-pounds of energy for hunting thick-skinned, dangerous game in Africa. Yes, the 338 falls short of the 9.2 millimeter or 375 caliber minimum some countries have for hunting that sort of game, and this is why the 338 Win Mag is generally not considered a quote-unquote buffalo caliber. But let's get real here. Assuming it's legal to use, and it is in some places, it's not like there's a magic switch that flips at 375 or 366 caliber, and nothing below that will work on a buffalo. Yes, you lose some frontal diameter, but you actually see an increase in bullet sectional density. Remember, you got that fantastic sectional density of 0.375 for a 300 grain 338 caliber bullet versus 0.305 for a 300 grain 375 caliber bullet. I'm not saying it's a good idea to hunt buffalo with a 338 Win Mag or that you should do it. Just food for thought. Like I said, great all-around hunting caliber, especially for game shifted a little bit towards the larger end. Call it medium to large size game and not so much the really, really big game. It's not quite as flat shooting as the 300 Win Mag, but it's still a pretty darn flat shooting round itself, and it uses a bigger and heavier bullet than the 300 Win Mag. So it has more kinetic energy than the 300 Win Mag, but also more recoil. Now, recoil can be an issue here, right? It's got about 15%-ish more recoil than a 300 Win Mag, but it's not terrible, though. You get a good recoil pad, a rifle that fits you well. You put a suppressor on it or a muzzle brake. All of those things really mitigate recoil. We actually have a 338 Win Mag that we use as a client rifle in Africa. We run 210 grain Barnes TTSX bullets out of it. That seems to hammer everything. That rifle is suppressed. Everybody that shoots it seems to love it. I'll share one more quote with you about the 338 Win Mag, and then we'll move on. This is from Tia Shoemaker, who is the daughter of legendary Alaska bear hunting guide Phil Shoemaker. She says this about the 338 Winchester Magnum in the Nosler Reloading Handbook. I quote, "Between good marksmanship and proper bullet selection, the cartridge is adequate for putting down all of Alaska's big game animals. Because the recoil of the 338 is relatively minimal, it allows the shooter to get back on target faster. Over the years at the range, I have witnessed many of the larger calibers actually deter the shooter from wanting to put too many rounds through the chamber. It is no surprise that the 338 becomes an ever-popular caliber for guides and hunters in Alaska." End of quote. So like I've said about other really popular cartridges, the 338 Win Mag seems to have all of the things you like in a cartridge without as much of the stuff that you don't like. And that's why it's so darn popular. The market really seems to have consolidated around the 338 Win Mag and to a lesser extent the 338 Lapua or the 338 Lapua as the two most popular 338 caliber rounds today. We'll talk more about the 338 Lapua here in a minute. Right now, you have a pretty wide selection of rifles and ammo for the 338 Win Mag, right? Winchester Model 70, Winchester XPR, Browning X-Bolt, Ruger Hawkeye and Guide Guns, Savage 110, Mossberg Patriot. You can get ammo from Barnes, Federal, Hornady, Norma, Nosler, Remington Swift, and Winchester. Now, the 338 Win Mag was really hard to get ammo for a long time during the ammo shortage from about 2020 into about 2022, but things seem to be a lot better on that front now, and let's hope it stays that way. 338 caliber is just not nearly as popular as 6.5 millimeter, 7 millimeter, 30 caliber, those things. But this is easily the most popular 338 caliber cartridge. Now let's talk about the cartridge that's number 2 right now, the 338 Lapua or the 338 Lapua. People make fun of me on some of my YouTube videos where I talk about the cartridge. The Finns actually say it 338 Lapua. As far as I know, Americans want to say 338 Lapua. I'm going to say Lapua, but you call it what you will. Now, the 338 Lapua was originally designed as a long-range sniper round capable of firing a 250-grain 338 caliber bullet at 3,000 feet per second. Specifically, the designers of this round were trying to build a very accurate and flat-shooting cartridge that was more powerful and had a longer effective range than the 7.62 by 51 millimeter NATO or the 308 Winchester in civilian use, but did not require as large or heavy of a rifle as the 50 BMG. Formally introduced by Lapua Limited in the late 1980s, and it was SAAMI standardized in 2013, the designers of the 338 Lapua Magnum accomplished those goals by utilizing a new case based on the 416 Rigby. It's not literally a 416 Rigby case, but very similar to it. The 338 Lapua is a very long, fat cartridge, 3.681 inches long, 0.585 inch case head diameter. Now, it is now very highly regarded as a long-range cartridge and has seen extensive use in the hands of military snipers from numerous countries. And in addition to having a very long, effective range, the cartridge is also, allegedly, capable of penetrating military body armor at ranges in excess of 1,000 yards. Though the record has since been broken, British Army sniper Corporal of Horse Craig Harrison held the record for the longest sniper kill for many years while using an Accuracy International sniper rifle chambered in 338 Lapua Magnum. He used that rifle and cartridge to kill 2 Taliban machine gunners 2,707 yards away in Afghanistan's Helmand province in 2009. American sniper Chris Kyle also used a Macmillan TAC 338 in this cartridge to achieve his longest personal kill of 2,100 yards in Iraq in 2008. The 338 Lapua has also gradually crossed over into the hunting community in recent years. Though few hunters really have a need to utilize the extreme long-range capabilities of the cartridge, it is still capable of delivering more power at longer range than just about any other comparable round. The cartridge also utilizes very aerodynamic bullets that retain energy and resist wind deflection exceptionally well. There are lots of target shooting loads out there for the 338 Lapua, but there are several hunting loads too. For instance, Swift makes a load with a 210 grain Sirocco at 3,057 feet per second for 5,200 foot-pounds of muzzle energy, or a 250 grain A-frame at 2,900 feet per second for nearly 4,700 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. Hornady makes a load for it with a 270 grain ELDX at 2,800 feet per second for about 4,700 foot-pounds of energy. You can get a load from Barnes with a 280 grain LRX at 2,600 feet per second for about 4,200 foot-pounds of energy, and a 300 grain Nosler AccuBond at 2,650 for about 4,677 foot-pounds of energy. Those aren't the only hunting loads for the cartridge, but those are some of the more representative ones. Now, that 300 grain AccuBond is the only factory load from Nosler, factory hunting load from Nosler. But if you hand load it, it can fling a 225 grain AccuBond at 3,100 feet per second. Now, you compare that 225 grain AccuBond at 3,100 to the same bullet at 2,750 from a 338 Win Mag and the same bullet at 2,600 from a 338-06. So it's a considerable step up in power from both. Now, there's not much you could not kill with a 338 Lapua using those loads. It's great for big, tough stuff, especially where tracking is difficult. Nilgai are an example. Not that you need a 338 Lapua or similar on one, but some outfitters like those really big, heavy-hitting rounds because those animals are so big, so tough. They don't tend to bleed real well when you shoot them, and they live in such thick, nasty country in South Texas. Some like the 338 Lapua for use on elk, moose, the big bears too. Tyler Friel has hunted pretty extensively with his 338 Lapua. He says his family has killed over a dozen bull moose with the cartridge, and he actually says he really likes a 285 grain ELD match bullet for use out of that cartridge on moose, for what it's worth. Heck, Brandon Maddox of Silencer Central even used one in combination with one of his banished 338 suppressors to cleanly kill a Cape Buffalo in 2023. He used a 270 grain ELDX bullet in that case. Now, like the 338 Win Mag, the 338 Lapua is really not legal to hunt thick-skinned, dangerous game everywhere, right? It meets that 4,000 foot-pound muzzle energy minimum, but it falls short of the 375 caliber minimum. I would not necessarily recommend shooting a Cape Buffalo with this cartridge, but it clearly can be done. Now, as powerful as this cartridge is, and it is very powerful, there are real downsides to using it afield. Most rifles in this cartridge are specifically designed for military use and or civilian long-range precision shooting, and therefore they're very expensive, very heavy, and they have a very long barrel. Like the Barrett MRAD, the Christensen Arms Modern Precision Rifle, the Ruger Precision Rifle, or the Sako TRG. Oftentimes, those rifles have very long 26 to 28-inch long barrels. Sometimes you'll find one as short as 24 inches, but we're still looking at really long barrels in general. The Savage 110 Long Range Hunter and the Weatherby Mark V are much lighter and not quite as expensive as the others, but they also have their own downsides, and that really comes in the recoil department. Now, the reality of dealing with such a powerful cartridge that was originally designed for extreme long-range performance presents the user with a dilemma. Do you want to lug a really big and heavy rifle weighing upwards of 15 pounds with a 26 to 28-inch barrel through the woods or up a mountain? Or would you rather use a lighter 8 to 10-pound rifle that is easier to carry but with much more rifle? Now, remember when I talked earlier about how the designers of the 338 Lapua wanted a cartridge with good long-range performance without requiring as large or heavy of a rifle as the 50 BMG? Well, as heavy as 338 Lapua rifles are, carrying one afield is certainly much easier than carrying a Barrett 50 cal that weighs 25 pounds or more. So yeah, there's plenty of hunters who take game with the 338 Lapua each year. And like I said, it will really do a number on even big elk, moose, big bears with good shot placement if the shooter can deal with those aforementioned issues. The cartridge is a handful though. Recoil is spicy with it, especially in one of those lighter rifles. So you really need a suppressor or ideally a muzzle brake on it. But if you put a brake on it, it gets really loud. I would not say that many people really quote-unquote need the 338 Lapua, but it can sure be a fun cartridge to hunt with if you're into that sort of thing. All in all, probably the 338 Lapua is number 2 next to the 338 Win Mag in terms of raw popularity overall worldwide right now. Truth be told, I don't think there's any need to bump up to a 338 Lapua unless you just want to, but if you want to, then have at it. All right, now we'll go across the Atlantic and talk about a 338 caliber cartridge that is primarily used over there, the 338 Blaser. This cartridge was introduced in 2009 at a similar time as the new R8 rifle line from Blaser. Craig Boddington had this to say about the cartridge in an article he wrote about it, and I quote, "I tend to think we have all the cartridges we really need. But since very few American manufacturers seem to think that way, there's no reason why the Europeans should either." End of quote. Now, the 338 Blaser was introduced in a lineup of 4 new cartridges at the behest of a new CEO to make a line of unique Blaser cartridges that quote-unquote improve on the 7 Rim Mag, 300 Win Mag, 338 Win Mag, and the 375 H&H with quote-unquote moderate pressures of up to 58,000 psi. And of course, they would offer all of these new cartridges in Blaser rifles. Now, 58,000 psi is still a lot of pressure, but it's not really standing on it. The 338 Blaser uses a rimless, beltless case based on a 404 Jeffery that fits in a standard 30-06 length action. So since it's based on a 404 Jeffery instead of a 375 H&H, it has a little bit fatter case, a little bit more case capacity, so you can load it to a lower pressure and still get improved, quote-unquote, improved performance compared to the old 338 Win Mag. Blaser currently offers 3 loads for it: 200 grain Accubon at 3050, a 210 grain Barnes at 2950, or a 230 grain Oryx at 2832. So about 100 foot per second advantage over the 338 Win Mag with those advertised performance specifications anyway. So it looks like they accomplished their goal, in this case anyway, of the 338 Blaser, quote-unquote, improving on the 338 Win Mag. It is almost exclusively a European offering, and it is CIP but not SAAMI standardized. Okay, now let's take a step down a bit and talk about a few smaller 338 caliber cartridges before we get back on the gas with some other stuff in this bore diameter with some serious horsepower. So first, let's talk about the 8.6 Blackout. This is not a SAAMI standardized round, but it is still an interesting cartridge worth talking about in the context of the rest of the episode. Introduced by the company Q, LLC, the 8.6 Blackout was rolled out at the 2022 SHOT Show. It's basically a 6.5 Creedmoor case necked up to 338 caliber or 8.58 millimeters. Typical short action cartridge. Maximum overall length 2.825 inches, same 0.473 inch case head diameter as the 308, 6.5 Creedmoor, all of those. Basically, any rifle that you can chamber in 308 or 6.5 Creedmoor will work in 8.6 Blackout with a barrel change. Look at an 8.6 Blackout and you'll see a short cartridge case with a very long bullet sticking out of it. Now, the 8.6 Blackout can be used with supersonic loads, but it really seems to be developed as a subsonic project. That's why it has the Blackout name, in line with the 300 Blackout, which was also designed for that sort of use. Now, the 8.6 Blackout also seems to work great in shorter barrels. And with those things in mind, it uses rifle barrels with a super fast 1 in 3, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 inch twist rate. Now, subsonic ammo just does not produce very impressive wound cavities with typical bullets. One of the ways you can get around that is to use super fast twist rates like this to help initiate expansion and make a larger wound cavity in an animal. Now, Q makes guns for it. So does Faxon, Gorilla Ammo, Bear Creek Arsenal, and some others. You can get it in bolt-action rifles and semi-auto models. Now, you can't get ammo from any big manufacturers, but those aforementioned companies, like Q and Gorilla, both make 8.6 Blackout ammo. Now, like I just said, this is mainly a subsonic project. Now, subsonic is subsonic. You have a very low velocity ceiling. Most stuff is loaded with a 1,050, 1,075 foot per second muzzle velocity. And you can't get much faster than that without risking it breaking the sound barrier depending on the ambient temperature. For this reason, subsonic ammo tends to use heavy for caliber bullets to maximize the cartridge performance in those loads. So for the 8.6 Blackout, you're looking at 285 grain, 300 grain, 342 grain bullets, that sort of thing. Now, this cartridge has more reach than most other subsonic cartridges, but it still has a very arcing trajectory. Now, like I mentioned, those very fast spin rates are designed to help initiate expansion and fling the bullet apart, rip off petals, that sort of thing when it strikes an object. So the really heavy stuff is normally subsonic for the 8.6 Blackout, but there are a couple of supersonic loads for it, like for instance a 190 grain fracturing supersonic load at 1,937 feet per second, or you can get a 210 grain Barnes TSX at 1925. So certainly supersonic, but not very fast loads. But both of those supersonic loads purport to deliver that performance out of pretty short barrels, like 12 to 16 inch long barrels. I could see the 8.6 Blackout being very effective on hogs, right? Especially you put a thermal on it and a silencer on an AR or something, very quiet and really just get after the hogs like that. Gorilla Ammo actually makes a so-called pork shredder line of ammo with a 342 grain bullet. I know Zach May from Reloading Quest did some work with the 8.6 Blackout using 300 grain cutting edge bullets, and it looked like in the gel that that thing flung itself apart and sent the copper petals everywhere like you would want it to. I personally think the 8.6 Blackout is a cool concept, but I just haven't gotten very excited about it. This cartridge has a ridiculously fast spin rate on its bullets. And like I just mentioned, it's primarily copper or copper alloy bullets that they're using in it. Now, you can potentially have bullet integrity issues with those super fast rotating bullets, especially a supersonic load with lead core bullets. Right, 190 grain supersonic load at 1937. You shoot that out of a 1-in-3 twist, and you'll have a bullet spinning at 464,000 RPM. But you can start to have bullet integrity issues once you get over 300,000 RPM. So this is well over 30% faster than that. This seems to be a cartridge that, while a cool concept, seems to be designed for a very specific niche that functions best under a very narrow set of conditions. Shoot me an email if you have any experience hunting with the 8.6 Blackout, though. I'd like to learn more about how it actually performs on hogs or deer or whatever. All right, next we have the 338 Federal. This cartridge was the result of a collaboration between Federal and SACO in 2006. It's basically a 308 Winchester necked up to 338 caliber. Same max average pressure as the 308, 62,000 psi, yet it is considerably more powerful. For instance, Federal currently offers two factory loads for the 338 Federal. 200 grain Fusion at 2,700 feet per second for about 3,200 foot-pounds of energy, or a 200 grain Trophy bonded tipped at 2,630 for just over 3,000 foot-pounds of energy. That is the same velocity as Federal's 165 grain Fusion for the 308, but with a bullet 45 grains heavier. It will also shoot the same bullet weight as the 308, about 150 to 250 feet per second faster. Now, the 338 Federal is more powerful than the 30-06, and it has the same muzzle energy as the 7 Rim Mag. It probably does better out of a shorter barrel than the 308 due to its larger diameter. Not eye-popping ballistics, but great, hard-hitting, short-action cartridge. More powerful, more recoil than a 308, but it's not getting into Magnum territory on either count. It is certainly one of the lighter recoiling cartridge that I discuss in this episode. We're talking 30-06 level recoil. 200 grain seems to be kind of the upper end of the best performance from the 338 Federal. You can use heavier bullets in it, but due to your limited case capacity with the 308, you just can't push them that fast. For instance, a 338 Win Mag will push a 225 grain bullet a little faster than the 338 Federal will push a 200 grain bullet. Like I said, both around 2,700 feet per second. But the 338 Federal is still plenty powerful for use in a lot of situations. At different times, Sacco, Ruger, Kimber, Savage, and Tikka, among others, have all produced rifles in that chambering. You can actually get the 338 Federal in the AR-10 platform from Wilson Combat and some other companies. The 338 Federal is wonderful for deer size game. Same is true for bigger stuff as well. I wouldn't say it's a long range cartridge, so to speak, but you can get out there a couple hundred yards with it. An AR-10 and 338 Federal would likely be a wonderful cartridge for feral hog control. Probably really thump them. You put a suppressor and a thermal on it and you are in business. Unfortunately, the 338 Federal seems to be a dying round. Federal is the only company that makes ammo for it right now, and they have trimmed their offerings for it lately. It's only in that fusion and trophy bonded tipped line that I just talked about. Now, since it has their name on it, Federal will be hesitant to completely discontinue the 338 Federal, but I don't get the impression they're making a lot of ammo for it these days. Over the course of the big ammo shortage, lots of people asked me if Federal discontinued it because they were having a hard time finding 338 Federal ammo, and some people actually really got upset with me and straight up tell me, no, I heard they've discontinued it, I can't find ammo, you can't find any on Gunbroker, blah, blah, blah. They did not drop it. Federal is continuing to produce the 338 Federal as I record this, but it was really hard to get for a long time. It is back now, though. We'll see how long that lasts. I actually found some 338 Federal factory ammo online this morning. So shoot me an email, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com, if you need help finding 338 Federal ammo, and I'll point you in the right direction. So cool concept, but just never really caught on. Maybe it was ahead of its time. Maybe there just wasn't a big need for it. But it's also in what seems like a decline right now, and we'll see how much longer the 338 Federal hangs around. All right, next we have the 338 Weatherby Rebated Precision Magnum. Released in 2022, this was the 16th Weatherby cartridge. Unusual for a Weatherby round, it has no double radius rounded shoulder and no belt. And like the name says, it has a rebated rim. Now, the Weatherby Mark V rifle uses two different actions. They have a 9-lug action that they chamber all of their Magnum cartridges in, right? All the stuff you'd normally think of with the Weatherby name, right? The 257, 270, 300, 30, 378, 416, 416 Weatherby, and others, to include the 340 and 338, 378 Weatherby cartridges we'll talk more about later. All those bigger cartridges are in the 9-lug Mark V. They also have their lighter and slimmer 6-lug Mark V action. This rifle is compatible with all of the quote-unquote standard cartridges. 6.5 Creedmoor, 308, 30-06, 280 Ackley Improve. Now, they made the 6.5 Weatherby RPM for that rifle. They liked how it performed. They decided to build a bigger cartridge as a lightweight backcountry thumper with the 338 RPM. Now, the 338 Weatherby RPM is a long, skinny cartridge, complete opposite of the Hornady series of precision rifle cartridges. The 338 RPM is 3.38 inches long. It has a rebated rim of 0.473 inches, same as the 308 30-06. It has a 0.500 inch case head diameter, minimal body taper, and a 35-degree shoulder. This is not the fastest 338 caliber cartridge, right? Adam Weatherby says they already have two of the fastest 338s, so that's not what they wanted here. But it has the same case rim diameter as the 30-06, but a fatter case head diameter. So basically, it seems like they took that 6-lug Weatherby Mark V action and they built the absolute biggest cartridge they could that would still fit and reliably function in that action, which is why it has somewhat unusual external dimensions. Now, Weatherby is somewhat unique in that they make both rifles and ammunition, so they have more control over the entire process than companies that just make one or the other. They make several different rifles in the Mark V line, all in 338 RPM, and those rifles have either 24, 20, or 18-inch long barrels. With this in mind, Weatherby actually publishes ballistics for their 338 Weatherby RPM ammo for both the 18 and 24-inch long barrel lengths. So they have 4 factory loads for the cartridge they publish right now. 185 grain Barnes TTSX at 3100 or 2860 from an 18-inch barrel. 225 TTSX at 2800 or 2615. 225 Interlock at 2800 or 2655. And a 225 grain AccuBond at 2825 or 2660. Now that 225 grain AccuBond load is going about as fast out of an 18-inch barrel as a 200 grain bullet out of a 338 Federal with a 24-inch barrel. And the cartridge is about as fast or faster than the 338 Win Mag when both are fired from 24-inch long barrels. One of the big selling points of the 6-lug Weatherby Mark V action is it is available in some very lightweight rifles. For instance, they make the Backcountry 2.0 titanium in 338 Weatherby RPM, and it weighs just 5 pounds without a scope. That rifle has an 18-inch long barrel. With the attached brake, I have heard it said that it recoils about like a 300 Win Mag or a 300 Weatherby. So stout recoil, but not terrible. But still, you are getting performance almost on the level, 100-ish feet per second slower than the 338 Win Mag out of a 5-pound rifle with an 18-inch long barrel that has manageable recoil. Now, this cartridge is still a pretty new offering. It's only available from Weatherby right now, both in terms of rifles and ammo, but it seems like a very efficient, well-designed round that is wonderful in a lightweight backcountry hunting rifle, and you could use it on basically everything this side of Cape Buffalo. Adam Weatherby actually brought a rifle in 338 Weatherby RPM to Africa with Joseph von Benedict a couple years ago. They took all manner of plains game with it. Seemed like it did really well. Like I said, lightweight, easy to carry rifle that just hits like a hammer. Now next we have another cartridge with performance along those lines, though it has a completely different heritage and was designed to fill a very different need. This is the 338 Ruger Compact Magnum. Now the 338 RCM was developed by taking a 375 Ruger case, necking it down to 338 caliber and shortening it slightly, and then it fits in a true short action rifle, 2.84 inches long. Though I have talked about it in more detail in other episodes, for our purposes here, just note that the 375 Ruger was designed to deliver the same, or even better performance than the old 375 H&H, but to do so out of a standard length instead of a Magnum length rifle action. It uses a standard Magnum bolt face, but the body of the 375 Ruger is larger in diameter than the non-belted portion of the 375 H&H case. Plus, it has a less tapered case body and a steeper shoulder that increases case capacity and allows the cartridge to deliver darned impressive performance out of a very compact package. So like I said, you take that cartridge case, neck it down to 338 caliber, and there you go. You have the 338 RCM. All right, so what the heck is the point of this cartridge? Let's rewind the clock back to the early 2000s. There was a guy named Rick Jameson that patented a set of design characteristics that you could incorporate into cartridges, so-called short and fat cartridges. And I'm not exactly sure how the heck he managed to do this, but somehow he managed to patent the ideas that were used for the Winchester Short Magnum and Super Short Magnum lines of cartridges. He tried to work out a deal where companies would pay him royalties on rifles and ammunition manufactured using those design principles. The details are very hazy here. Winchester and Jameson ended up reaching a settlement, but I think part of the settlement was nobody could talk about the details of it, so it sounds like they paid him a bunch of money and would get to use his design for a certain period of time. So Winchester and Browning ended up making rifles and ammunition for those cartridges, and like I said, paying him some sort of money, probably, to do that. But other companies did not want to pay those royalties, Ruger in particular. They said on the Hornady podcast that the folks at Ruger had already produced a number of rifles in .300 Winchester Short Magnum, then received a letter from Jameson's attorney saying Ruger would need to pay Jameson royalties on those rifles if they ended up selling them. So, as the story goes, the folks at Ruger contacted the folks at Hornady saying, hey, we don't want to pay royalties. I want you to design us a new cartridge similar enough to the Winchester Short Magnum, the .300 Winchester Short Magnum, that it will function in these rifles, but different enough from that cartridge where we won't have to pay him royalties. Well, the folks at Hornady did their thing. They designed a cartridge now known as the .300 Ruger Compact Magnum that checked all those boxes. They modified those .300 Winchester Short Magnum rifles, got them out the door. Everyone was happy. They decided it was a cool design and then modified it a little bit to shoot .338 caliber bullets. And now we have this cartridge, the .338 Ruger Compact Magnum. One of the selling points of this cartridge was it was designed to deliver optimal performance out of a shorter, say 20-inch long barrel. Now, the .338 Ruger Compact Magnum cannot quite match, say, the .338 Win Mag when that cartridge is shot out of a longer 24 or 26-inch long barrel. But it does really well with that shorter barrel. So we have a short action cartridge with a 20-inch long barrel. You have the whole quote-unquote compact adjective on display here. Hornady currently offers one factory load for the cartridge, 225 grain SST at about 2750, so just under 3,800 foot-pounds of energy. That's in their Superformance line, advertised with a 24-inch long barrel. That's probably about the upper end of the performance you'll see for this cartridge. But like I just said, the whole point of the .338 RCM was to deliver good performance with a shorter barrel, so probably 2,600, 2,650 with a 20-inch long barrel. So about 100 feet per second-ish, maybe 150 feet per second slower out of a 20-inch long barrel than the .338 Win Mag is with a 24-inch or a 26-inch long barrel. Now, one of the side benefits of this cartridge is you could put it in a rifle with a shorter barrel, shorter overall length like that, and potentially put a silencer on the end of it and have an overall package about the same length, maybe even a little shorter than a .338 Win Mag with performance almost on that level. So we have a pretty easy to carry, quote-unquote, thumper of a cartridge like that. The .338 RCM is basically dead right now. Like I said, Hornady does still list that one load on their website. Even Ruger has dropped it from their line now, and they don't make any rifles in this chambering. I couldn't even find any used ones on Gunbroker. Not a bad concept overall, just didn't quite catch on. Might have been a little ahead of its time, coming out in the early 2000s like that, before silencers were nearly as common as they are today. But we'll talk more about this in a minute with another cartridge, but a .338 Thumper with an 18-inch to 20-inch barrel, capable both up close and with several hundred yards of reach, would be a nice combination with a suppressor these days. All right, next we have the .338 Marlin, and this is not the cartridge I was just talking about with the .338 Thumper. No, this cartridge was the fruits of an attempt to get all the performance possible out of the Marlin rifle platform. According to the Hornady Reloading Handbook, the folks at Hornady built the .338 Marlin using a case based loosely on the .376 Steyr. Released in 2009, the .338 Marlin has a rimmed case, but has a very small rim diameter, just a little bit larger than the case body, and it has somewhat odd dimensions. 0.553-inch rim diameter, 0.506-inch case head diameter, 1.89-inch case length, 2.585 inches overall length. Result is a short, fat, rimmed cartridge that packs a lot of power into the Marlin 336 rifle. Same kind of concept as I talked about earlier with the 338 Weatherby RPM, where they just tried to build a cartridge that was absolutely as big as possible, yet would still fit and function in this rifle chamber. Completely different products overall, but same general idea. Hornady makes one load in this chambering, 200 grain FTX in their lever evolution line, 2,565 foot per second muzzle velocity for about 2,900 foot-pounds of energy. That's similar performance to a 30-06 with that bullet weight, but out of a lever-action rifle. That is unheard of performance from a traditional tubular lever-action rifle like that, not like something like a BLR. Now, since that ammo is from the Lever Evolution line, it uses a pointed bullet with a polymer tip with a shockingly high BC of .430. That's incredible for a lever-action cartridge like this that's still safe to use in a tubular magazine. It actually compares somewhat favorably to the heavy-hitting .348 Winchester I mentioned earlier. You can hunt deer, bear, hogs, even elk, and moose with it at a short to moderate range. But this is another dying cartridge. Hornady makes that one load. Marlin was the only company I know of that ever made rifles in .338 Marlin, but they don't anymore. And once again, I could find ammo for it on Gunbroker, but no rifles. All right, next we have the 338 Norma. This is a CIP cartridge in Europe, standardized 2010. This is not a hunting round, but it is a precision shooting cartridge that came from the desire of a guy named Jimmy Sloan to have a long-range shooting round ideal for use between 1,000 and 1,500 yards. Basically, he wanted a cartridge that could fire a really high BC, 300 grain, .338 caliber bullet at around 2,800 feet per second. Norma standardized the Wildcat developed for his use. Similar to the 338 Lapua, the 338 Norma has a shorter case and more head height. So that means that they can seat that 300 grain Sierra Match King bullet, .768 G1 BC, without it intruding into the case. Now, the 338 Lapua is a little older, and that 300 grain Sierra bullet didn't exist when it was developed, so the 338 Lapua was built to shoot a 250 grain bullet. It can use that same 300 grain Sierra, and it can fire it faster than the 338 Norma because it has a bigger case, but using that really long bullet requires it to be seated deeper into the case to fit within the chamber and magazine restrictions of many 338 Lapua rifles. This can result in degraded accuracy due to gases flowing over the heel of the bullet boat tail when fired. That's not to say it can't be accurate shooting that bullet. It's just the 338 Norma has an edge here because it has more head height. The details vary a lot, though. For instance, some manufacturers do build 338 Lapua rifles to accommodate physically longer cartridges where that isn't an issue. But the 338 Norma has a reputation for being a fantastically accurate cartridge. The military has picked it up, they use it in a sniping role, and also, as wild as it sounds, the U.S. military is also exploring using this round in a machine gun for extreme long-range fire. They want a new machine gun platform with a longer effective range than the 7.62x51 cartridge that provides effects on target at extended range approaching what you get from a 50 BMG. SIG makes what they call the MG338 and 338 Norma to fill that role, and testing and evaluation is underway. Typical ballistics for a 338 Norma are the 300 grain Sierra Match King at 2,657 feet per second. You may notice the next few rounds I'll talk about follow recipes very similar to those I outlined for the 30 Nosler, 300 Rum, 300 Weatherby, and 378 Weatherby from episode 286, my 30 caliber episode. That is not an accident. Let's dive into the details. We'll start with the 338 Remington Ultra Magnum. Introduced in 2002, the 338 Rum was part of Remington's new Remington Ultra Magnum cartridge line for the new millennium. The 338 Rum uses a 404 Jeffery as a parent case, so beltless case, a little bit fatter than a 375 H&H, necked down to 338 caliber, full Magnum length, cartridge overall length here, 3.6 inches long, slightly rebated rim. Now, the whole Remington Ultra Magnum line follows the same general idea I was talking about for the 338 Win Mag, with the original Win Mag line of cartridge being perfect for hunters in the so-called greatest generation. Well, the Rums were boomer rounds. A guy born in 1950 would have been 52 in 2002, and all of these cartridges, especially the 338 Rum, perfect for taking out for elk, go to Africa, go to Alaska, all of that, and you can do it with a reasonably priced Remington Model 700 rifle. Very flat shooting, hard hitting round. Barnes, Remington, Nosler, Hornady, Norma all make ammo for the 338 Rum right now. Remington makes a 250 grain core lock load at 2,860 feet per second. You can get a load from Nosler with a 225 grain Accubon at 2,975, or from Barnes, for instance, a 250 grain long range expanding bullet at 2,910. So you compare 225 Accubon at 2,975 to that 225 grain Accubon at 2,750 for the 338 Win Mag. It's a little bit less powerful than the 338 Lapua hand load of a 225 Accubon at 3,100. But to be fair, if we hand load the 338 Rum, you can get 3,200 feet per second out of that thing at the upper end because it has such a large case capacity. Now that's impressive performance, flinging a 225 grain 338 caliber bullet at velocities approaching or even exceeding 3,000 feet per second like that. But that comes at the expense of lots of recoil and muzzle blast. Probably around 20 to 30% more recoil, depending on the details, compared to the 338 Win Mag. I would not say this is an efficient cartridge either, but it hits like a hammer. If you can deal with the recoil, there's not much that you could not take with this cartridge. The problem is we're getting into that area where it's just simply too much for most hunters to handle. I had a hunter booked on a black bear hunt several years ago, came with a 338 Rum, took a 50-yard shot on a black bear. This is a good-sized black bear, but we're still talking about a 250, 300-pound animal. About a 50-yard shot over bait, hit it a little bit too low, and we had a heck of a tracking job trying to find that bear. We did find it, but it went a long way, and it was just because he made a bad shot on it. Now, the fact that it was a 338 Rum and was going so darn fast, it did cause more damage to that bear than would have been the case with the exact same shot placement with something smaller. Say if you would have shot it with a 308, for instance. But the flip side of the coin is if he would have shot it with a 308, then the odds are he probably would have made a better shot on it. So that's the thing you deal with these really popular cartridges like that. Yeah, you get a little bit more room for error with them sometimes, but you're also more likely to need that extra room for error with a bad shot. And there's also plenty of situations where your shot is so bad that tiny bit of extra room for error doesn't really make a difference. Shoot it in the leg, way back in the guts, something like that. This cartridge is also on somewhat shaky ground logistically right now too. I mentioned who made ammo, and you can get ammo from a couple different companies right now. I'm not aware of any company, to include Remington, that actually makes rifles in 338 Remington Ultra Magnum. Remington does have a spot on their website in a drop-down menu where they have the cartridge listed, but no rifles come up when you pull it down. Hopefully, they have plans to reintroduce that cartridge as they continue to reorganize and revamp things on their end after their bankruptcy from a couple years ago. So it might be more of a temporary pause than a permanent discontinuing of the cartridge. But even if they don't bring it back, there are still a decent number of rifles that you can find on the secondary market out there. Old Remingtons, Gunworks made rifles in 338 Rum for a little while as well. Of course, you can get a custom job done, something like that. So it's not as difficult to mess with as some of the other cartridges I've talked about, but it's also not even close to being a mainstream round at this instant. Now, I talked about recoil a second ago. Part of that is due to the fact that you're shooting a pretty heavy bullet at a fast velocity. Another component is that it uses a lot of powder to achieve that velocity. Like I said, it's not very efficient. This cartridge has a very large case capacity, And Nosler is listing charges anywhere from about 80 up to over 100 grains of powder to achieve velocities with a 225 grain bullet between, say, 2,800 and about 3,200 feet per second. Well, there's another cartridge we're about to talk about that delivers performance very similar to the 338 Rum, but uses a lot less powder to do so. That is the 33 Nosler. Now, as I record this, the lineup of Nosler cartridges includes the 22 Nosler, which is 22 caliber, introduced in 2017, 27 Nosler, 277 caliber, introduced in 2020, the 30 Nosler, 30 caliber, introduced in 2016, and the 33 Nosler, 338 caliber, introduced in 2016. As an interesting aside, there are 35 and 36 Nosler cartridges listed as being SAAMI standardized, but neither one is in current production or anything like that. I guess Nosler maybe just went ahead and got those standardized with SAAMI, but has never done anything with them for one reason or another. Maybe that'll happen in the future. In any case, the big Nosler cartridges, to include the 33 Nosler, use a 404 Jeffery case, neck down, got a rebated rim, shortened to fit in a 30-06 length action. So it has the same parent case as the 338 Rum, but instead of being a full-length Magnum, it is a standard length cartridge, and it has a maximum overall length of 3.34 inches. So instead of being a long, fat cartridge like the 338 Rum, it is a short, fat cartridge. The 26, 27, 30, and 33 Nosler cartridges all feature factory loads with the AccuBond long-range bullet. Nosler introduced that bullet in 2013, which was right on the leading edge of a new trend with higher BC hunting bullets. And it was one of the first, if not the first, purpose-built hunting bullet from a big company like Nosler designed for use at extended range. It actually came out before the Hornady ELD-X. And like I said, all of those cartridges, to include the 33 Nosler, feature at least one factory load with the AccuBond long range. Now, the 33 Nosler has a load with a 265 grain AccuBond long range. That bullet has a G1BC of .732, and it can launch it at about 2775. That's what Nosler advertises anyway. So very high BC bullet, pretty darn fast. And the 33 Nosler is also a relatively efficient cartridge, more so than the 338 Rum. And it generates velocities very close to the 338 Rum 225 AccuBond factory load, but uses less powder to do so. So if you're shooting the same weight bullet at the same velocity or close to the same velocity, but using less powder in the process, then you will get less recoil. Now, the 338 Rum, since it is a physically larger cartridge with a larger case capacity, does have a higher ceiling on its performance than the 33 Nosler. But the 33 Nosler is right there with it, but like I said, recoils less. I wouldn't say it is a light recoiling cartridge, but if you want something that really hauls the mail and is more shootable, then the 33 Nosler is worth looking into. Now, I talked about that load with the 265 grain AccuBond long range. They also make a load with a 225 ETIP, 2975 feet per second, 225 AccuBond at 3025, 250 grain partition at 2750, right? So that's the same velocity as the 338 Win Mag with a 225 grain bullet. And then you have a load with a 300 grain custom competition at 2550. There's that 300 grain 338 caliber bullet at 2550. That's almost exactly the same performance as the 375 H&H. Now, the custom competition bullet is not a hunting bullet, and I darn sure don't recommend trying to shoot a Cape Buffalo with it, but the fact remains it is pushing a really heavy for caliber bullet at about the same velocity as the 375 does. Now, the 33 Nosler is a very specialized cartridge, and I'm not aware of any companies other than Nosler that make rifles or ammo for it. But it does seem to be pretty popular within the Nosler universe. Now, Nosler is similar to Weatherby in that they make both rifles and ammunition, so they have a lot of control over that whole process with things, especially with their proprietary cartridges. Other companies have picked up various different Nosler cartridges. I think the 26, 28, and 30 are all produced by other companies like Christensen Arms makes rifles and some of those cartridges and whatnot. But as far as I know, the 33 Nosler is still just a primary Nosler deal. And like I said, it's also just a specialized cartridge. Not many people want or need the performance that it delivers. But if you're the sort of person that does want that sort of performance, well, they got you covered. I mentioned earlier the appeal of these really powerful .338 caliber cartridges for hunting big, tough game like nilgai in particular. Well, a listener I correspond with frequently, I'm not sure he wants me to mention his name, so I won't, but he actually used a 33 Nosler with the 225 grain Accubon, shot a nilgai down in South Texas. He said he shot it in the shoulder, pretty standard broadside shot, and it just fell over dead just like that. Now, he said that rifle had a muzzle brake on it, and recoil was not too bad. But he also said that he was not wearing ear protection when he took that shot, and his ears were ringing like crazy afterwards. And so he had some mixed feelings about being happy at taking his nilgai, but also upset with himself for not putting in ear protection and getting excited taking the shot. Now, none of this should be taken as saying that you need to use a 33 Nosler or a 338 RUM or a 338 Lapua on a nilgai or any other game. But sometimes some people just want it. And it's nice that you have cartridges that can do that. All right, now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about another Weatherby cartridge, the 340 Weatherby. And we'll go back in time a little bit to do that. Roy Weatherby rolled out this cartridge in 1962, his response to the 338 Winchester Magnum. Just like he did with the 300 Weatherby versus the 300 H&H, and eventually the 300 Win Mag, which did not exist at the time he introduced the 300 Weatherby, Roy Weatherby elected to build a 338 caliber cartridge that exceeded the performance of the 338 Win Mag. Formula was similar to the 300 Weatherby. Take a 300 H&H case, blow it out, neck it up to 338 caliber, remove some of the taper, give it the signature double radius shoulder, and voila, you have the 340 Weatherby. Don't be confused by the bigger number. I think that was just a marketing thing to show that it was bigger and more powerful than the 338 Win Mag. The 340 Weatherby still uses the same 338 caliber bullet. It has a longer overall length and case length. It's actually 3.7 inches long, and it needs a full-length Magnum rifle action. Roy Weatherby was a heck of a marketer, and he did a good job of ensuring celebrities like John Wayne and Roy Rogers had Weatherby rifles that they would hunt with and have pictures taken with these rifles that he could use to see, hey, see, look, these cool people have my rifles. You should get one too. In addition to that, his cartridges, especially at the time, had eye-popping ballistics. The 340 Weatherby was no exception. Now, there are 3 current factory loads offered for the 340 from Weatherby. The first is a 225 grain Barnes TTSX at 2,970 feet per second, a 225 grain interlock at 3,000 feet per second, and there's also a 250 grain interlock at 2,900 feet per second. It is not in current production. It's not listed on the Nosler website, but Midway USA actually still lists, right now anyway, an old Nosler load of a 225 grain Accubon at 3,010 feet per second for just under 5,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. So 225 Accubon at 3010 for the 340 Weatherby. You compare that to a 225 at 2750 for the 338 Win Mag. That same bullet at 2975 for the 338 RUM. And the same bullet out of the 33 Nosler at 3,025 feet per second. Now, once again, we have that 338 Lapua hand load at about 3,100 feet per second. So the 33 Nosler, 338 RUM, 340 Weatherby, all right there together, a little bit ahead of the 338 Win Mag, and then the 338 Lapua a little bit faster than them. And remember, just like was the case with the 338 RUM versus the 33 Nosler. The 33 Nosler is giving very similar performance to the 340 Weatherby out of a smaller package. Part of the reason the 33 Nosler does well in this area is because it has a larger diameter case. So even though it's quite a bit shorter than the 340 Weatherby case, it makes up for that volume discrepancy to a certain degree. But the 33 Nosler and the 338 rum did not exist when Roy Weatherby made this cartridge. No, it was designed as an improvement over the 338 Win Mag, and it accomplished that goal. Has a longer case, more case capacity, hold more powder, push that bullet faster. That is indeed the case. It's shooting a bullet that's the same weight, about 250-ish feet per second faster than the 338 Win Mag. The 340 Weatherby has about 36 inches of bullet drop at 500 yards with a 200-yard zero. Compare that to 44 inches of bullet drop for the 338 Win Mag. At that range, it still has 2,400 foot-pounds of retained energy versus 1968 for the 338 Win Mag. Very impressive performance, especially considering how old the 340 Weatherby is. Everything you liked about the 338 Win Mag, just more. Faster velocity, flatter trajectory, more retained velocity and energy at extended range, better performance in the wind, but you also get some of the other things you don't like about the 338 Win Mag, like recoil and muzzle blast. Ammo is also less widespread and more expensive. For instance, just messing around researching for this episode, I found 338 Win Mag ammo priced at $50 to $60 a box on the low end versus $90 a box and going up from there for the 340 Weatherby. And Weatherby is the sole provider of rifles and ammo right now for the 340 Weatherby. Now, believe it or not, Weatherby actually has yet another 338 caliber cartridge. The next one is the 338-378 Weatherby Magnum. Just like the name states, it is a 378 Weatherby case necked down to 338 caliber. Now, the 378 Weatherby is itself a unique design, somewhat similar to the 416 Rigby. This is a belted Magnum case, massive round, fits in a full-length Magnum. It's actually a little bit longer than a traditional full-length Magnum with a SAAMI maximum cartridge overall length of 3.763 inches instead of 3.6 or 3.7 inches long. So it has a long, fat case, gigantic powder capacity. Weatherby claims it has a larger case capacity and higher velocity than the 338 Lapua. You've ever heard the saying, less is more? Well, the 338-378 Weatherby is an example of more is more. Weatherby currently lists 2 factory loads for it. 225 grain TTSX at 3,180 feet per second for over 5,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy, and a 262 grain Hammer Custom at 2,950 feet per second for also just over 5,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. That's 458 Win Mag levels of energy. A 500 grain bullet at 2,140 feet per second is giving you 5,084 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. Now, if you shoot that 225 grain TTSX with a 300-yard zero, it's going to be 3.8 inches high at 200 yards and just 8.8 inches low at 400 yards. Just 23.5 inches of drop at 500 yards, and it is still retaining 2,600 foot-pounds of energy out that far. For reference, the 6.5 Creedmoor has just over 2,300 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. This is a gigantic cartridge burning a lot of powder to push a pretty heavy bullet really fast. It delivers lots of recoil. For that reason, Weatherby puts muzzle brakes on all their rifles in this chambering. That really tames the recoil, but you get lots of muzzle blast in that situation. Ammo's very expensive, and you have a pretty narrow selection of both rifles and ammo. Now, this cartridge is also so physically large that Weatherby lists their rifles with only a 2-round magazine capacity, so you can put 1 in the chamber, 2 in the magazine, so that's only 3 rounds you can carry. And you need a 26-inch long barrel for optimum performance. Usually, it's a 26-inch long barrel with a 2-inch break, so it's really 28 inches long overall, or even longer if you take the break off and you put a suppressor on instead. But it can be darn effective in the right hands. Very flat shooting, hits like a Mack truck when it all comes together. Now, Nosler lists a hand load shooting a 225 grain Accubon bullet at 3,219 feet per second for this cartridge. You compare that to that same 225 at 2,750 for the 338 Win Mag, 2,975 for the 338 Rum, 3025 for the 33 Nosler, and 3010 for the 340 Weatherby. So quite a bit faster. I mean, it's a 200 foot per second advantage over the already pretty fast 338 RUM 33 Nosler and 340 Weatherby. But you're burning well over 100 grains of powder to get that level of performance out of this hand load. Now, Nosler also does list a hand load for this cartridge with a 300 grain AccuBond or AccuBond long range, and you could push that bullet, looks like over 2,800 feet per second out of the 338, 378 Weatherby. And that is really hauling the mail for a bullet like that. Now, this is the farthest thing from an efficient cartridge, but then again, neither is a drag racer. Now, funny enough, that hand load I mentioned earlier for the 338 RUM with the 225 grain AccuBond is right there with the max hand load for the 338, 378 Weatherby, and actually is doing so using a little bit less powder. I guess you'll have to see for yourself which one is more powerful, but they're both really powerful, and you can fling that 225 grain AccuBond really fast. Now, as to Weatherby's claim about it outperforming the 338 Lapua, the Hornady and Nosler load manuals are both saying the 338, 378 Weatherby has a 50 to 100 foot per second advantage over the 338 Lapua. Now, what velocity you actually obtained with either one of them, and the same was also true with that 338 RUM load I was talking about that was really fast. That really remains to be seen, what you're going to get out of your rifle. Basically, though, all of these last few cartridges I've talked about are really very powerful cartridges that offer a very high level of performance with the 338 caliber bullet. We can nitpick around the edges that this one is a little bit better than that one and blah, 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 but they're all big. They're all powerful. You can use them for basically the same stuff as far as hunting goes, and it's just a matter of each one of them having a certain advantage in one niche or another to decide which is best for you. Now, I'm certain that all of these rounds are quite effective in the right hands, but the question remains, do you actually need any of these super powerful 338 caliber cartridges? I would say most of the time, no. But if you're the sort of person that wants that sort of performance, then have at it. With that said, I've noticed a couple of trends with two other cartridges we're about to talk about that might indicate we are seeing a shift away from super high velocity rounds that burn lots of powder to push a heavy bullet really fast, and perhaps seeing a trend towards stuff that works better out of shorter barrels. I talked about the 338 RCM, the 338 Weatherby RPM, stuff like that. Well, the same is also true with these next two cartridges we're going to talk about as I wrap up. So first is the 8.5 by 55 Blaser, introduced 2019. This cartridge uses a short, fat case and is designed for use in short-barreled rifles. It actually has a 55 millimeter case, which is the same length as the 6.5 Swede. So I think part of that naming convention leads some people to just dismiss it out of hand, thinking, oh, it's just a 6.5 Swede necked up to 8.5 millimeter or 33 caliber. That's not actually true because, like I said, it uses a fatter case and has more case capacity than you would get with the 6.5 Swede case just necked up. Now, this cartridge is designed for use with 50 centimeter and shorter barrels. 50 centimeters is 19.7 inches. Call it 20 inches. Now, the 8.5 by 55 Blaser is 2.98 inches long overall, has a 0.535 inch case head diameter. It is a rimless, beltless case. 3 companies make ammo for it. Blaser makes it themselves, Norma makes it, and a company called Sachs, they're based out of Germany, makes ammo as well. Blaser makes rifles in this cartridge. Now, they make it in their regular R8 straight pull rifle, but they also make it in their R8 silence rifle. This is a pretty innovative design that has an integrated silencer with a 47 centimeter long barrel. That's 18 and a half inches long. And remember, this barrel has an integrated silencer in it. So it is an 18 and a half inch long barreled gun with a suppressor. A very fat but short barrel. Now, the rifle itself is not cheap. It's also primarily available in Europe. And that whole rifle would be an NFA item here because it has an integrated silencer on it. We'll talk more about the rifle here in a second. It's also available in the Mauser Model 18 rifle. that's a traditional sporting Mauser-style bolt-action rifle. Now, as far as factory loads for ammo, you got 140 grain Sachs lead-free at 3379 feet per second for about 3,500 foot-pounds of energy. 160 grain Barnes TTSX at 3,084 for about 3,378 foot-pounds of energy. 230 grain Norma Oryx, 2,690 feet per second for just under 3,700 foot-pounds of energy. Pretty similar ballistics to the 338 RCM. Now, like I said, those aren't eye-popping ballistics, especially when you compare them to those really heavy-hitting cartridges we just talked about. But this sounds like a really solid, heavy-hitting cartridge designed for use at shorter range, possibly on driven hunts, like are more common in Europe, where you're taking a shorter range shot at an animal that might be moving, or you may have just a very short amount of time to take a shot on it. So it doesn't have a lot of reach on it, but it is going fast enough that you could shoot out to a couple hundred yards without problems. But like I said, you go back, especially with that R8 silence rifle. That's a rifle barrel that's only 18 and a half inches long that's already suppressed. So it's light and it's handy, and that's going to tamp down on your recoil. It's going to make it quieter. You'll lose, I'm sure, some velocity off of those specs I just gave you, but you're shooting at something at 100 meters. It's probably not going to matter that much, and the thing is probably still going to hammer something like a red stag or a boar or a fallow deer. I'm sure you take it to Africa, be great on plains game too. Easier on the shoulder than a non-suppressed rifle in that cartridge would be. Easy on the ears, handy, all that stuff. Seems like an amazing idea. Now, the problem with this cartridge is it is still pretty new. It is a proprietary Blaser cartridge. And like I said, I don't know of any rifles other than the Blaser models and that Mauser that you can get it in. Ammo's basically non-existent in the United States at this point. That's a European offering. Maybe that'll change, but maybe it won't. You got a couple of different factory loads, but not many of them. So there are definitely logistical concerns with this cartridge. Even so, very intriguing concept. We'll talk more about that here in a second. Now let's talk about the last cartridge today, the 338 Advanced Rifle cartridge. This is literally a brand new round announced at the end of 2024 by Hornady. I've never shot it. I've never even seen one. Since it is literally so brand new, I am just going off the Hornady marketing info right now because that's all I have. This is the newest member of the Advanced Rifle cartridge family. It joins the 6mm ARC, released in 2020, and the 22 ARC, announced in late 2023. All three cartridges are descended from the 6.5 Grendel, which is itself descended from the 7.62x39 and 220 Russian cartridges. The 338 ARC is just like its sibling cartridges, just necked up to 338 caliber. All these cartridges have a 2.26-inch maximum overall length, so it fits in an AR-15 platform. Same 0.441-inch case head as the 6.5 Grendel 22 ARC, 6mm ARC, uses the same bolt face as them. 52,000 PSI max SAAMI pressure, 1 8-inch SAAMI twist rate. That is very fast for a 338 caliber cartridge. Hornady has announced two factory loads. One with a 307 grain sub-X at 1,050 feet per second, 751 foot-pounds of energy. That's a subsonic loading. And they have a supersonic loading, 175 grain hollow point at 2,075 feet per second for 1,672 foot-pounds of energy. Those specs don't seem all that impressive at first glance, so what is the deal? Now, Hornady says in their marketing materials, remember, all I can go off of is what they're telling the world right now, because that's the only information available as I record this. They say this cartridge is designed for optimum performance out of a shorter barrel in a suppressed package, especially with subsonic ammo. You got to keep the velocity below the speed of sound, so you have a very low upper velocity limit. The only way to improve the performance of a subsonic cartridge is to use heavier bullets. This is the opposite of the trend we have seen elsewhere towards smaller caliber cartridges. Here, since velocity is fixed, you see a trend towards larger caliber and heavier 4 caliber bullets. So for instance, you take a subsonic 77 grain Match King out of a 223 that has a whopping 188 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. 190 grain Sub X out of a 300 Blackout has 465 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. It actually has nearly twice as much kinetic energy at 300 yards as the subsonic 223 does at the muzzle. You take this 307 grain Sub X out of a 338 ARC, it has 752 foot-pounds of muzzle energy and 473 foot-pounds of kinetic energy at 500 yards, or more than the 300 Blackout at the muzzle. I can hear you now. But John, we already have a round that does this, and you just talked about it, the 8.6 Blackout. That is true, and we have the same idea here. Now, the 8.6 Blackout purports to do some of the same things as the 338 ARC, but it is a physically larger cartridge that requires an AR-10 to function, while the 338 ARC fits in the smaller AR-15. Now, unlike the 8.6 Blackout, the 338 ARC also has Hornady's backing. That is worth something in and of itself. Hornady is making factory ammo for it right now. We might see some other companies pick it up soon too, like they have for other cartridges that Hornady has rolled out recently. Now, Hornady also normally does a good job of getting rifle companies on board from the start as well to make rifles in these new cartridges. At this instant, it looks like we have some of the usual suspects like CMMG, Faxon, Noveski, Odinworks, Palmetto, Proof Research, Seekins, and others. Mainly looking at AR-15s right now, but will also work in a mini action bolt action. I would not be surprised to see the Howa Mini in the future in 338 ARC, for instance. Same with the Ruger American like they did with the 22 ARC. This is probably going to be a quiet round in an AR, subsonic, suppressed, super duper duper quiet in a bolt gun with subsonic ammo. Now, the guys at Hornady say they have designed the 338 ARC to be less finicky than the 8.6 Blackout. They say velocities will be more consistent across the board, especially with subsonic ammo. Now, subsonic ammo gets a bad rap for poor accuracy sometimes. That's sort of true, but it's actually more often a shooter issue. It requires a lot of holdover to hit targets out past 100 yards with subsonic ammo. It can be done, though. But velocity spreads are very important. So the guys at Hornady say that's less of an issue with the 338 ARC. I haven't shot it yet, so I can't tell you if that's actually the case myself. They also, like I say it's more consistent and less finicky than other cartridges, especially when you're going between subsonic and supersonic ammo and between suppressed versus unsuppressed. Now, if you're running an AR with a suppressor on it and or with subsonic ammo, you can have issues with it being overgassed or undergassed. You might have problems feeding. You get it set up and working perfectly for subsonic use, for instance, you might have issues with supersonic ammo or vice versa. I have experienced those issues myself with a 300 Blackout and 5.56 going back and forth between suppressed and unsuppressed, for instance. I'm always needing to mess with them. I'm left-handed as well, so it's always just shooting gas straight back into my face when it's a little bit overgassed. Hornady says they have designed the 338 ARC to mitigate those issues. Now, all of that stuff sounds great, but like I said, I have zero experience with this cartridge as I record this, so we'll just have to see how it all pans out in reality. It is an interesting concept. I like what they are trying to do. I have been less than impressed with subsonic offerings for other cartridges for hunting in the past, like the 300 Blackout, so I am curious to learn more about the 338 ARC in the future. Kind of similar to the 8.6 Blackout, I could really see this cartridge fitting in that pig hunting niche, right? You're running it with subsonic ammo suppressed with a thermal. You get on a group of hogs at night, especially like you start dropping them, shooting them in the head or the neck, and they're dropping in their tracks. You could really do some damage to a sounder of hogs out there before they know what the heck is going on, if this all works out like they say it does. And of course, assuming it is legal to use where you hunt, this could also be a darn effective deer hunting cartridge too. Okay, so that's the 338 ARC. We have talked about 18 cartridges over the course of the last hour and 45 minutes. Oldest was the 33 Winchester centerfire, released in 1902. Newest was the 338 ARC, released in 2024, literally a couple days before I started recording this. There's an interesting mix of rounds in this episode. We saw a bunch of one-offs with the 338 Federal, 338-06, the 338 Lapua, the 338 Rum, 338 Norma, 33 Nosler, 86 Blackout. You have Jeffery with the two 333 siblings. You have Winchester with the 33 Winchester centerfire and the 338 Win Mag. Blaser with the 8.5 by 55 and the 338 Blaser. You have Hornady involved with the 338 RPM, 338 Marlin, and 338 RCM. Weatherby with the 338 Weatherby RPM, 340 Weatherby, and 338 378 Weatherby. I didn't realize how much Weatherby liked 338 caliber cartridges with those three separate offerings until I started recording this episode. Really, same is true with Hornady too. As I got to thinking about things and doing research for this episode, it seems like the advent of better quality bullets has hurt the 33 caliber bore diameter in terms of popularity. Now, by that, I mean some hunters who previously might have used the 338 Win Mag, for instance, or a similar cartridge with a heavy for caliber cup and core bullet seem to have now stepped down to, say, a 7mm or a 30 caliber cartridge with a tougher bullet that is delivering performance as good as, or maybe even a little bit better than, a 338 Win Mag with those older bullets. The fact that 33 caliber is a so-called quote-unquote tweener bore diameter that falls shy of that 375 caliber threshold gives it a lower ceiling on performance on really big game that just falls short of being ideal for use on a buffalo or an elephant, for instance. I'm not saying it's a bad bore diameter or that nobody uses it, because lots of people still do, but just it seems like the ideal use cases for it, and by that I mean the roles that it is markedly better than other bore diameters, are limited. Alaska and Canada in particular both seem like they remain strongholds for the 33 caliber bore diameter, especially the 338 Win Mag and the 338 Lapua, like I was talking about with Tia Shoemaker and Tyler Friel. But to be fair, there aren't nearly as many moose and bear hunters in those places as there are elk hunters in the western parts of the lower 48, which used to be one of the major use cases for the 338 Win Mag, for instance. And of course, the number of elk hunters in the country cannot even touch the number of deer hunters in the country. Now, that's not saying you can't hunt deer with a 33 caliber cartridge, because people do, but you also don't need a cartridge that big for that work, and there's lots of smaller stuff that will work really well without some of the downsides of the various 33s. Out of curiosity, I dug into some of the Boone and Crockett data on the methods of take that they list in their interactive record book. Out of all the cartridges I talked about today, the 338 Win Mag is far and away the most popular. There are literally over 10 times as many entries taken with the 338 Win Mag than is the case with the 340 Weatherby and the 338 Rum. And those are number 2 and 3 behind the 338 Win Mag in terms of the various 30 caliber cartridges they list in the record book. Now, this is for all species in the book combined: deer, sheep, bison, moose, bear, everything. Now, in terms of animals, moose was easily the most popular species of game taken with the 338 Win Mag in terms of raw number of animals in the book anyway. And that's if you lump Alaska, Canada, and Cheris moose all together. Alaska brown bear and grizzly lumped together are next. Then you have black bear. Then elk and bison. A surprisingly large number of goats and sheep in there too, but well below the number of moose and the various bears taken, and elk too. Then there's a few caribou and, of course, a handful of deer and pronghorn. That information jives with my personal thoughts on the ideal use cases for the 338 Win Mag, and really you can extend that to those other big 33 caliber cartridges as well. They're not as well represented in the book because they're not as popular, but they still fit into those same ideal use cases, where I think they're excellent for the bigger stuff, especially in situations where you might run into a bear, like Canada, Alaska, or certain parts of the lower 48 where grizzly bear live. And yeah, you can hunt deer with them, but that's not the best tool for the job. So really, like I said, the big bears, moose, and to a lesser extent elk and whatnot really fits into that ideal use case for it. Now, interestingly, you started to see a drop-off in the prevalence of the .338 Win Mag starting at about 2014. Now, it is still in use, of course. It's just not as popular as it was previously. And like I said, I'm guessing here, but I think that's not because the .338 caliber got worse or less capable. I just think it is because other cartridges have become more popular and more capable, possibly with the advent of better quality bullets, better understanding of things in terms of terminal ballistics. Let me know your thoughts on this. If you think I'm off base, let me know an alternate hypothesis. It also just might not mean anything either. I just may be reading into a situation that doesn't exist. But in any case, with that in mind, what does the future hold for the .338 caliber bore diameter? Perhaps we will see something else from Hornady in .338 caliber in the future, maybe a .338 PRC for the long-range world. Some in my audience suggested that would be a possibility when I asked for what their predictions were for the future. I admit the .338 ARC did catch me by surprise, but it does make sense in the light of the way things have been going in the world. With the continued adoption of silencers among hunters in the USA and the recent and hopefully continuing speeding up of ATF approvals for silencers, we may see more cartridges specifically optimized for use in that realm now that silencers are not as exotic as they were even as recently as 2019-2020. I think the .338 RCM was ahead of its time with that good performance out of a shorter barrel that lends itself to use with a silencer. I think that particular cartridge is dying and probably will not come back, but I would not be surprised to see something else like it come along from somebody. Maybe Hornady, maybe somebody else. I personally am very intrigued by the R8 silence in 8.5 by 55 Blaser. They make the R8 silence in a couple of other different cartridges, but I'm especially intrigued by that cartridge rifle combination. I would love to see a rifle cartridge combination along those lines come out here in the USA as well. Now, there would certainly be legal and practical hurdles to doing so, but a heavy-hitting cartridge that works well out of a silenced, short-barreled rifle in a compact package like that seems very appealing to me. It's also easier to envision a rifle like that catching on here in 2024 than was the case in 2019. I'm looking for something more powerful and, realistically louder than the .338 ARC, but still optimized in that realm. Supersonic performance where you get a real good thumper like that has a couple hundred yards effective range, but still does well out of that shorter barrel, so it's not a handicap in thick woods. And also silenced, also recoil that's not too bad. I also would not be shocked to see a bifurcation in the market where we eventually have some cartridges and rifles optimized for use at closer range out of shorter barreled rifles that are also silenced, along with other cartridges, maybe like I said, a .338 PRC, that are optimized for use at longer range out of a longer barreled rifle, silenced or not silenced, whatever, but at longer range. Now, like I said, all that is just my opinion. Treat it as such. But let me know what your thoughts are along these lines. You think that's a good idea? Do you see something else appealing for the .338 caliber bore diameter in the future? Shoot me an email. Let me know your thoughts. Let's check back in a couple years and we'll see how these predictions pan out. More to follow. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Now, if you did, be sure to check out my .30 caliber episode, episode 286, my .270 caliber episode, episode 291, my 9.3 and .375 caliber episode, 297, my 40 and 50 caliber plus episodes with Kevin Robertson in 300 in episode 329, and my 25 caliber episode in episode 328. Don't worry, other episodes along these lines are coming in the future for 22 caliber, 6mm, 6.5mm, 7mm, etc. Drop me a line, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com. Send any feedback you have on this episode and requests for the future. As usual, I have written detailed articles about many of these cartridges for the Big Game Hunting blog. There are links to those articles in the show notes, so you can check them out. Additionally, click the other link in the show notes or go to huntingguns101.com. Sign up there to get my free ebook on the best hunting cartridges and to join my email list. If you like the podcast, You will love getting those emails. So make sure you are getting them too by going to huntingguns101.com. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and we can help. Thanks for listening. See you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to the BigGameHuntingBlog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.
Okay, it's official. We are very much in the final sprint to Election Day. And face it, between debates, polling releases, even court appearances, it can feel exhausting, even impossible to keep up with. I'm Brad Milkey. I'm the host of Start Here, the daily podcast from ABC News. And every morning, my team and I get you caught up on the day's news in a quick, straightforward way that's easy to understand, with just enough context so you can listen, get it, and go on with your day. So, kickstart your morning. Start smart with Start Here and ABC News, because staying informed shouldn't feel overwhelming.